Yeah, so last week I had just an incredible Sunday. Literally last Sunday, my son Gino and I, we were blessed with some tickets to go to the Steeler game. And so we got to head down on Sunday afternoon together. We got there a little bit early. We're big Steeler fans, like I'm sure many of you are. And this is my son Gino at the stadium. We got there early. He's a huge Cam Hayward fan, right? I am too. We love Cam. And we got there early so we could see the Steelers warm up. We love to see just how big the players are and what they do for warm-ups. My son plays football, and we're having a great day. We found good parking. We got to the stadium. It was going good. We had some really, really good food, and the weather was starting to turn just a little bit warmer. The sun was coming out, and of course, everything, prospects for that day, they were just high. They were really, really fun. It was going incredible, and we're hanging out there, and of course, the game is going on, and one thing that matters importantly when you go to a Steeler game is you want to sit around people who they're nice, and they're kind, and they're behaving, right? And we did. We met some really cool people around us, and it was fun, and we're joking, and we're talking, and at halftime, everything was fantastic. We stuck down in our seats. Of course, we were 8 seats up from the field, 8 rows up from the field. Just really phenomenal tickets. And during halftime, we were watching the players come back out, and we're watching them warm up, and I'm like, gee, I think something's happening. He goes, what? I said, look down there. I said, Kenny is throwing with his helmet on. And of course, the stadium started this low murmur and this low sort of rumble. And then the Steelers, they were on defense first. They got the ball back. And then sure enough, we watched Kenny Pickett run out onto the field. And the artist formerly known as Heinz Field, it erupted like absolutely crazy. I leaned over to the guy in front of me. I said, you would think he walked on water to get out to that huddle right now. The crowd was going, Kenny, Kenny. This is a picture. Like we saw it. We were right there. And it was electric and fun. And like, of course, they scored a couple of touchdowns, and in the fourth quarter, the Steelers are winning, and everything was going great until it wasn't anymore. Right? If you watched the game, you saw it unraveled, and we ended up losing. We threw a Hail Mary pass, and it got intercepted, and I think that was the moment where everybody sort of sat down and exhaled and was sad and got quiet, and right at that moment when everything was all done and the game was over, I felt something on my head. Something hit me on my hat. And I put my hand up there, and I was like, what on earth? And I took my hat off, and check it out. This is what happened. A bird pooped on my head. Like, no joke, during the third quarter, I was looking up in the sky, and there was a swarm of birds flying over the upper deck, and I thought, I wonder if they ever let anything loose. Like, who's the lucky one that gets to receive that gift today? It was me, right? Everything was unraveling. Everything wasn't so good anymore. And it made me think of this moment. Like I love to eat at Jimmy John's, and they have really, really funny stuff and perspective stuff on the wall. They got signs up, and if you ever go there, they have this one that said, life isn't always a sunny day. Sometimes you're the bird, sometimes you're the statue. Right? That day, out of 61,000 fans in the stadium, I was the statue. It was my lucky day. But if you think about it, like it's great to be a bird, right? Flying around, going wherever you want, doing apparently whatever you want on whomever you want, right? That sounds fun and exciting. And we make it out to seem like a statue is a bad thing, but think about it. If you're a statue, you're made of something really precious and valuable. You're being honored for something done in life. You're in a prominent spot where everyone looks at you. And listen. When you think about that perspective, think about it, it's really quite a funny thing. It all depends on how we look at it. George Carlin, comedian, said this, have you ever noticed that anybody who's driving slower than you, they're an idiot? And anyone who's going faster than you, well, they're a maniac. That's perspective, right? What are they thinking about you and how you're driving? Stephen Covey said it this way, we see the world not as it is, but as we are, or as we're conditioned to see it. We must learn to look at the lens through which we see the world. This is what I'm talking about in driving at when I say perspective is a funny thing. It all depends on how we look at it. And perspective is ultimately, eternally important when it comes to our lens of looking at God. See, that's why we're doing this study in this series called Revealed. And today we're going to be in Genesis chapter 11. If you want to turn your Bibles to Genesis chapter 11, it's on page 18 of my Bible, so likely somewhere in the neighborhood of your Bible or on your device. Go ahead and scroll there. And I got to catch us up. Last week, John Riley did a phenomenal job kicking us off, and he ended his sermon in the Garden of Eden, right as everything sort of ended, and there was a curse. Adam and Eve, they ate the fruit, and there was a curse put on the land, and they're now not allowed to be in the garden anymore, but it ended on this beautiful promise that was foreshadowing and prophesying about Jesus. One day he would come and defeat the serpent once and for all. And after that moment, you would think that we as humans, that we learn our lesson. But in just 3 or 4 chapters, it unravels even further. Of course, as you study Revealed, you're going to read about Cain and Abel and the very first murder that took place. A brother murdered a brother. Murdered a brother. That takes place in the scriptures after Adam and Eve. And then we read about this man named Lamech, and he was a guy that first took on not only one wife, but 2 wives. And he sings this song about murder, and he's celebrating evil things. And you see, as Genesis unfolds in just 5 or 6 chapters, the story just got started, but all of a sudden, these beautiful things that God created, they're being marred and destroyed. And they're everything that they weren't intended to be. And we read in Genesis 6, verse 5, that the Lord saw the wickedness of man, and he saw that it was great in all the earth, and that every intention in the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. So God decides to step in, and he decides to purify the blood that had been spread on the earth by sending water, great amounts of water. And this is the section of scripture. You're going to read about this in Revealed, about the flood and how God saved Noah and his family because he saw that Noah was righteous. And we read in Genesis 6 and 7, we read about the flood and the animals and the ark. And eventually, when the water subsides and Noah and his family, they're back on dry ground, we see that God does something amazing. He reiterates the direction and the call for humanity to Noah, and he doesn't just say it once, he says it twice. This is what we read in Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 and 7. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." I want you guys to spread out. I want you guys to multiply. I want you to fill the entire earth. And then later on, he says it again as he's making this new covenant with Noah and his family. He said, "And you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it." And you and I would think, right? Okay, here's the second chance. We think about this whenever we're being disciplined. If I can have a second chance, I'll get it right next time. Well, of course, it doesn't take 6 chapters for it to unravel. It takes 1 or 2. And we read, even after this new covenant and this dry land, once again, after the preservation and rescue of Noah and the rest of humanity, we read that evil comes back up. Noah drinks too much. He gets drunk, and he has a son who takes advantage of his vulnerability and humiliates him. And then we read what we're going to read today, Genesis chapter 11, the story that we know and refer to as the Tower of Babel. Here's what the scriptures say when we read Genesis 11, verse 1. It says this: "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east," this is after the ark, "they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we would be dispersed over the whole face of the whole earth.'" Now, for many of us, we are familiar with the story, the Tower of Babel. Maybe we heard it if we went to church as kids. Maybe you heard references to it. And a lot of times, when you look at this story, you're sort of left with this question. And I don't know if we ever have the courage to say it out loud, but I know that we all wonder this in our minds. What was wrong with that? It feels like good progress. It feels like, hey, they're using technology, bricks, and they're coming together. The people are one. Doesn't God want us to be one? Doesn't he want us to be unified? And they're building a city, and they're using progress to build something in the center of it, and they don't want to be scattered. They want to stay together, and they want to stay protected. But perspective, remember what I said? It's a funny thing. It all depends on how we look at it. The story goes on. And this is what it says. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they'll do. And nothing they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there, the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Now, if you're looking at Babel and you're wondering, like, what was wrong with all that? If you look at what God does in this moment, it's easy to then start thinking, God, what was up with that? Because sometimes it feels like, God, like, were you just insecure? Are you just wrathful? Are you mean-spirited? They're just building a tower. They're just unified. Why did you have to swoop down, come in, and mess it all up? There you go again. There's the God I've heard about, the one who doesn't really care about people and is only into himself. It's so easy in this moment through this story, and I've talked to many folks who have looked at this moment and said, I don't get God there. It doesn't make sense. Why would he do that if he was good and if he was gracious and he was actually loving? Why did he come in? Why did he confuse their language? Why did he stop the progress and spread them all out? Perspective is a funny thing. It all depends on how we look at things. And actually, it all depends on how we're willing to look at things. You see, upon closer examination, when you actually look at what was going on in Babel, what the people were doing, they were building a great, great city and a great, great tower. They were trying to make a name for themselves. When you look really closely at what they were actually doing and what they were doing it with and how they were going about it, and when you look at what they were not doing, the whole story changes. You see, upon closer examination, when I look at Babel and I look at this idea of a group of people who wanted to build something really, really tall, and they wanted to have a name for themselves, and they wanted everybody in one place, what you see the Tower of Babel was an attempt at what I would call a pseudo-Eden. See, the whole idea of a real tall tower and a name for themselves and everybody concentrated in one area, they were trying to recreate and reestablish what they lost in Eden. This whole tower thing was an attempt to feel significant again. If you build something tall, everyone will see it, and you'll look like you're amazing, and everyone will celebrate you. That's a sense of significance. This is what the folks were doing. They were trying to reestablish and resecure themselves, a name for themselves. Listen, when we've got a name, everyone likes us. We're always accepted. You never buy a drink for yourself. Everyone knows you and celebrates you. And this is what was in the hearts of man through this idea of Babel and this city where everyone is in one location. That was an attempt, a human attempt without God, mind you, to feel secure. It was a chance and an attempt to control people by having them all in one location. You see, what Adam and Eve lost in the Garden of Eden the moment they ate that fruit is they were significant, they already were accepted, and they already were secure. But when they opened that fruit and their eyes were open, they now had needs to feel and be significant. They now no longer were automatically secure and accepted. They longed to be that. You and I, we all long for significance. We all long to be accepted in our world. We all long to feel like we can control things in our world. You ever build a Tower of Babel in your life? Did you ever try to accomplish something so people can celebrate it? Is it a number financially? Is it a house in a certain neighborhood? Is it a title? Do you ever attach yourself to someone who was significant so you could get a little bit of that special significance rubbing off on you because you're near them? How about being accepted? How about this idea of making a name for ourselves? Do you ever use social media for that? Do you ever parent in a way where you're so disappointed or you're so excited about what your kids, not because it in and of itself was good, because it in and of itself made you look good, and it made you proud, and it made you feel good about your future? We all build these things called Babel towers where we're longing to create a pseudo-Eden, this recreation of the Garden of Eden. But the problem is we're doing it without God. They were making a name for themselves. This is the very first time in scriptures where idolatry enters into the story. They were wanting to worship something other than God. You see, here's the reality about your life and my life as well. Anything that we look to make us feel significant, whether it's something that we're longing to become or something that we already have, a lifestyle, a home, a car, a possession, anything we look to make us feel secure and accepted, those are the things that ultimately get our true worship. They're our gods. They get our time. They get our focus. They get our resources. They're the things that we want to preserve and hold on to because they're providing something in our world. But here's the prophetic thing about Babel. Just like the people, when God stepped in and rewrited the story and they realized and God showed them that this was idolatry and they were doing this without Him. You can never build Eden without God. He's the only one that can truly bring significance and acceptance and security to our world. When God stepped into the story and they were confused and they were scattered and everything that they had progressed on stopped in the middle of it, you see, that's what happens to us in our world when we fully realize that we're trusting and worshiping something other than God Himself. And if it hasn't happened yet, it's about to. The very first moment, Babel was a pseudo-Eden attempt. And what they were doing is they were trying to worship something other than God. They were trying to not need God anymore. See, not only is what they were doing evil in and of itself, but the way they were doing it was also evil and hurtful to God Himself. You see, here's what you look at, and this doesn't jump off the page when you read that story. Again, the story seems innocent in and of itself, but perspective, it's a funny thing when we're willing to shift our posture and our vantage point and look at it a little bit closely and from a different angle. What we see going on is how they were doing it was evil. You see, what happened is this story, the Tower of Babel, this tower and this staircase in this city, in this fortified area, it was actually a budding imperial empire. You know, when you look at the Hebrew language that was used to record and write down everything we read about in Genesis, the language used there is eerily similar and identical to the same language that the Pharaoh and Egyptian used when they enslaved the Israelites. They said, "Come, let us make bricks." Does that sound familiar? You see, you don't build an empire where everyone is happy. Someone's got to do the hard work. Someone has to go get the resources. Someone has to sweat. Someone likely will get abused and used and mistreated and misused along the way. Maybe even, dare I say, enslaved. You see, the idea about building a city, the actual imagery in the original Hebrew language was a fortified city. Why did they need walls if everyone was there? See, the only reason you need walls if everyone is always there, it's not for protection, it's for control. It wasn't to keep something out, it was to keep people in. This was enslavement. It was entrapment. It was the direct misuse and abuse and mistreatment of the Imago Dei, the image of God that every human being has divinely imprinted into their hearts by God Himself. And when people are mistreated, it displeases God Himself. This was an empire. It was sinister in its motive. And they were making every effort to make things one, but mistreating people in the process. See, not only is what they were doing evil in God's eye and how they were doing it evil in God's eye, but just looking at it very, very directly, what they were not doing is evil in God's eye. Do you remember the last thing God said to them? Be fruitful, multiply, go fill the earth. What did they do? Let's stay in one area and do this for ourselves. See, what they were not doing is they were not obeying God. The Tower of Babel is direct disobedience to God's direction. See, and when we disobey God, when we do our own version of our future rather than God's directed version of our future, what we're doing is we're doing and operating in a human effort that's aimed at ultimately dethroning God and glorifying ourselves. Not so innocent after all, is it? It's this attempt that delivered idolatry. It's this technological advancement that dehumanized people and mistreated the Imago Dei in them. Although it seems wonderful on the surface, Babel was ultimately evil, and it ultimately ended in direct disobedience of God's voice. Be fruitful, multiply, go fill the earth. Speaking of the earth, did you ever take a close look at it? This is what you'll see if you bend down and get down on the ground and look. This is what dirt looks like. Up close and personal, dirt is brown. Dirt has potential to turn into mud. If you're someone who loves white shoes like I do, dirt is not your friend. I avoid dirt. Dirt is the thing we clean up. Dirt is the thing that we don't want to see. Dirt is the thing that we like to cover up in our landscaping and at our homes and make things beautiful. And that's really what the earth looks like up close. But what happens when we change our location and our proximity and we look at the earth from a different vantage point? This is ultimately what it looks like. It's beautiful. It's marvelous. It's glorious. It's what God created. You see, though it takes work and it isn't easy and it asks us to move from where we're comfortable or used to, perspective is an amazing thing when we're willing to move and shift our posture and see things from a different vantage point. It's true in all of life, but it's especially true when it comes to God. C.S. Lewis said it this way in The Magician's Nephew. He said, what you see and what you hear depends a great deal on where you are standing in life. Your vantage point in life shapes your perspective, and it shapes my perspective. He said it also depends on what sort of person you are. You see, in order to see God clearly, in order to see God for who he is as compared to who we've made him out to be or who we thought he was, it requires our willingness to shift our perspective and to consider things a little bit differently. See, sometimes we give God just a quick glance when what he needs and deserves is a really long look. And something changes when we're willing to shift our perspective about God himself, especially with these stories we read about in the Old Testament that can often lead us to think things that are simply untrue about God. Do you ever have someone in your life that on your best days you still really don't like them? Am I the only one that a bird poops on and doesn't like people sometimes, right? That's me, right? Yeah, see, I think we all have people in our life that frustrate us. They annoy us. They rub us the wrong way. There's something about their personality and our personality. And it doesn't mix real well. And sometimes when we have to stay around them, maybe we work with them. Maybe they're our kids' teachers or coaches. Maybe they live near us. Sometimes the people we live with in our homes, we don't always all get along, and it's hard sometimes. It feels like sandpaper rubbing against each other. And I'm learning something in life, that the way to see things from their perspective, I have to remember that they have a story and they have a reason and they have something going on in their world. Even if I'm frustrated by them and I don't like them, a lot of times what I have to do is I have to slow myself down and I have to consider some things about their life. I have to think about and look at what was their posture like when I interacted with them. Like, where were they? What was their tone of voice? What did they say and how did they say it and where were they when they said it? Sometimes I have to look more than just at their posture. If I have one of my kids' coaches does something and I don't love it, it doesn't sit well with me, I got to not only look at their posture, I got to look at their potential. What could they have done? Were they in charge? Were they a leader? Could they have done even more, or did they go above and beyond what they were supposed to be doing? Not only do I have to look at their posture and their potential, but I have to look at their practice. Well, what did they actually do? And sometimes I have to sort through my emotions and my reactions and really look at it as neutrally as I can and say, what did they do? You see, something changes when we look at the Tower of Babel and we really consider God's posture and God's potential and God's practice. You look at God's posture. Did you notice that God didn't sit up in heaven and command this thing from the heavenly realms? No, it said God came down and saw for himself. What does that posture tell you about God? See, when someone comes to me that tells me they love me, When Brooke and I are frustrated with each other and we do it over the phone, something doesn't feel right there. But when we sit face to face, knee to knee, and we look each other in the eye and we start to talk about this and our posture is in close proximity, something changes. I not only hear words, but I can feel heart. When you look at God in this story, God came down to see for himself. His posture shows us and reveals us that he loves and that he cares. Look at God's potential. What could he have done? What was within his rights to do as God, the creator of this creation that was being marred and destroyed and turned upside down? You know, he already had flooded it and wiped it clean. God could have pushed a reset button. He had every right to do that. The people were disobeying him. God could have set things upside down and turned them over again, but what did God do despite his potential? Look at his practice. God came in despite, all that he was afforded within his rights to do. It shows me his graciousness and his mercy. And what was God's practice? He dispersed them and confused their language and set them about their ways. And that tells me that God wasn't thinking just about this moment. He was thinking about all of eternity. See, God's goodness is not always just temporally based. It's always eternally based. See, this is a part of what we read in Genesis chapter 11 that can feel a little bit confusing. So why did he have to do that thing with the language? Like they were all getting along and they were all speaking the same language. Well, it's interestingly enough, if you're reading along in the scriptures, when you read Genesis chapter 10, the chapter before the Tower of Babel, you see that all of the nations spread out and they broke into their clans and they all had their own languages, and it's fascinating. It's an ethnograph of the world. You can start to see the formation of many nations that we know about today, and of course, many groups of people that we read about in the scriptures. But Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, actually, chronologically happens before Genesis chapter 10. And it gives us a clue to what God was doing, and it gives us a clue to God's heart for us. You see, I see God's confusing of their language actually as a gift from God. You see, he had told them to be fruitful and multiply and spread out and fill the earth. Why was that so important to God? See, because on a very, very simple level, God made the whole earth. And the whole earth was a created gift for us to enjoy, to explore, to experience. Do you ever travel throughout the world? Do you ever get excited about seeing a new area and a new territory, and somehow, some way, you see something you've never seen before, and it wows you and it makes you think something even more beautiful about God himself? That's why God wanted them to spread out. Not only did he want us to enjoy and experience all of creation, but I think he knew that families, sometimes, let's be honest, they need space. We're not always just supposed to live right with all of our own family, and sometimes space is a good thing. It allows us to form our own family unit and to be fruitful and multiply and develop our rules and our customs and our traditions and our holiday celebrations. Some of you guys know, right? Family and space is a good thing. That's what God is doing here. He's gifting us with what we need to thrive and flourish. And not only is it about exploring the whole world and families needing space, but it's also about this fact that diversity and difference, it's a good thing for us. Do you ever not only travel to a different country, but meet people who are different than you? It's really quite beautiful to get to know them. It's really quite amazing to see how they see the world and how they grew up. And if God did create the all of humanity with the Imago Dei, if he put his image and his likeness in all of us, then diversity and difference is a really beautiful thing, because the more diverse people that I meet, when I see people who aren't just from here and who aren't just like me, the more clearly I get to see who God is, because I get to see his imprint placed on their life, not just the imprints I'm used to and familiar with. See, this is a gift. The confusion and spreading out of Babel is a gift. It's God allowing and providing us a way to see him more clearly, to better inform our perspective of God himself. That he's gracious, that he's good, that he's near, and that he cares, and that he's eternally minded. See, when you look at this story and you see what God does, God came down and he acted on behalf of the people who didn't know what they were doing, in order to rescue them from themselves. God came down and acted on their behalf. They didn't know what they were doing, and he rescued them from themselves. Does that sound familiar? See, we're doing this series called Revealed, in this study called Revealed, and we're trying to find Jesus. Where are you in the Old Testament? He's right here. That's a direct picture of Jesus sacrificing on the cross for all of us, for all of eternity. Jesus said it this way in John chapter 5. Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise." See, I believe Jesus was present in this moment of Babel, and he watched God, his Father, do this beautiful thing on their behalf to rescue them from themselves, and it gave him courage and a direct example to follow when he himself would be on the cross. And he would say, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." See, Babel is a picture and a foreshadowing of Jesus' sacrifice on our behalf on the cross, providing a way for us to experience our forever in heaven with God. See, Babel's not a story about this insecure and distant, harsh God who's jealous all the time and who's looking to just come in and mess things up. No, it's a story and beautiful revelation about God who loves us and who will do whatever he can for our eternal good, even if in the short run it doesn't feel good. You see, when you're thinking about perspective, you have to understand, and I have to understand, that God sees things way differently than we do. And Sally Lloyd Jones, who wrote the Jesus Storybook Bible, she puts the story of Babel into perspective, and she says it this way. She said, "God knew however high they reached and however hard they tried, that people could never get back to heaven by themselves. People didn't need a staircase, they needed a rescuer. Because the way back to heaven wasn't a staircase, it was a person. And people could never reach up to heaven, so heaven would have to come down to them." See, that's what the story of Babel tells us about God. And that's a direct picture of Jesus himself and his ultimate redemption for us that he provided on the cross. See, my hope and my prayer as we study Revealed and as we learn to see Jesus throughout all of the scriptures is that we will ultimately learn to see God for who he is and not for who we've created him to be ourselves, that we would give him a long look, not just a quick glance. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, thanks for your posture and your practice. Thanks for the way you love us, God, and come in and sometimes, Lord, say no or not yet to us, but in return, it's ultimately providence for us and our ultimate good and our eternal good. And Father, I ask right now that you would work in our hearts and our minds, and that you would do the divine thing of reframing and reshaping our perspective of you so we can learn to see you as you've revealed yourself to be, not necessarily who we've created or thought you to be. Would you do a work in our hearts, Lord? Because God, I know in my life, the more clearly I see you, it makes all the difference in my world, in my life. So God, I ask that you would do that work in our hearts and that we would see you clearly. Lord, thank you for who you are and who you've revealed yourself to be. I pray this all in Jesus' name, amen.